Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com and celebrity spokesmodel for our new t-shirt. Long and short sleeves, multicolored. It says, "You can like things that suck. Just admit it." I think that that's a wise word for the fabulous and somewhat demented universe of classical music. Like what you want, but be honest. That's what we try to do here, don't we? But this is an easy one because we're talking about fabulousness. And the fabulousness that we're talking about is Haydn's Symphony number 34 in D minor, major, major, minor, major, minor, minor, major. No one's quite sure what D it's in. And the reason is because the entire symphony is based in the key of D, either minor or major, and often both. Not necessarily simultaneously, but within the same movement. So it's a piece of music that is what they call homotonal. That means one key. Get it? But the fascinating thing about this is that just because it's in the same key, that allows Haydn to do amazing things emotionally and expressively. Like all of his symphonies, this one has a form and a shape which is completely unlike any of the others. And it's kind of hard to believe he managed to do that like 107 times, but he did. And this is the second to last of all of the symphonies that begins with a slow movement, with an Adagio. And it's a dark, very dark Adagio. It's wonderfully dark. Now, how do I know this is the second to the last? Well, here comes another shameless plug, and wait for you to spend some money. If you look at my book, Exploring Haydn, I have at the end of this book something I am extremely proud of. I actually took the time to make charts of all the symphonies, all the string quartets, all the piano trios, and all the piano sonatas. Not just telling you what key they're in and when they were written, if we know, and what the scoring is, and all those things, but also there's a little key at the end of attributes. And these attributes could be just about anything. I mean, they are symphonies in 3 movements, symphonies in church sonata form, that is with an opening slow movement, symphonies with horns in high C, things we've already talked about, a lot of these things, symphonies with prominent concertante parts for various soloists, symphonies with slow first movement introductions, symphonies ending with 3 repeated chords, symphonies with the minuet in second place, symphonies with extremely slow adagio movements. I mean, they get sorted out in a zillion possible ways so that you can find your way through them based on some of the characteristics you particularly enjoy or may want to compare. So, if you're interested in this, it should be available on Amazon, and if it's not, or they're charging $300,000 for it, the publisher is called Roman, Rowman, and Littlefield, and they have a website where you can get the book. And you get like all kinds of, there's some samples that go with it that are downloadable, but now with streaming, you can find all the music anyway. I do recommend it for that reason. It's a very, very useful way to negotiate all of this music, all the instrumental music particularly. But now, let's talk about number 35's opening Adagio. The striking thing about this Adagio is that it's extremely large. Now, most performances that you'll hear, even period instrument influenced ones, will not play it with both halves repeated. If you do, it's going to last around 12 minutes. And that's about as long as the rest of the symphony. So it's a big, front-weighted piece of music. It really is. Most of the time, they get rid of the second half repeat so that the opening Adagio is like 7 or 8 minutes, maybe 9 if you're pushing it. So it's not quite as long. But it's a big movement, and it's written for the full orchestra, because most of these church sonatas, when they have an opening Adagio, it will include the full instrumental forces. So that includes the 2 horns and the 2 oboes, although they're used very abstemiously, very, very carefully, but they are there. And they add a touch of color and weight to the sonority. this movement is otherwise, formally speaking, extremely similar to the one we just heard in Symphony number 33, and which was also very dark and very, very pathetic, full of pathos. And it's quite similar in concept. What happens is that it's in sonata form. That is, it has an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation. And the exposition ends in the major key, and the relative major usually, but it's the major key. And then the development starts in that major key and works its way back to the original minor key. And the recapitulation, the restatement of the opening section, that is somewhat abbreviated, but it takes place entirely in D minor, in the minor key, which gives the entire movement a very tragic cast. It really is a weighty movement, fabulous. And what's wonderful about it is that, Haydn was famous for what they call his Sturm und Drang period, storm and stress, for writing music of emotional extremes, that was of a new level of intensity in purely instrumental music. But this comes before that. And if you've been following this crusade, even though some of the symphonies are out of whack chronologically, and you can't be 100% sure exactly where they go, what we find is that if you take number 33, which we just heard, and number 34, this one, they're slow movements. You see that the Sturm und Drang was not something that he woke up one morning and said, "Oh my God, I feel so neurotic. I have to just change my style." Not at all. He was headed in that direction. This symphony is a real precursor. And of course, way back we heard, I think it was number 26, the Lamentazione Symphony, which is also a precursor of the Sturm und Drang period. No one's quite sure exactly what the chronology of all these pieces was. But the fact of the matter is that Haydn had access to these deeper, or not deeper, but, darker emotions. I always hate to say deeper because really happiness is a deep emotion. It really is. And, sophistication and joy and pensiveness and all these things, tragic is exaggerated in music. And we value it not because it's deeper, but simply because it's easier. It's just easier to listen to. It's easier for us to grasp. And so because we think we understand it more, we think it's more important. And maybe it should be for that reason. But Haydn's happiness is as deep as his sadness. And there has been an awful lot of depth of that sort coming up to this point. But he's enriching his style, moving to expressive extremes. And in this symphony, he really, really does it, because this opening movement is so big and so powerful that the rest of the symphony, in a way, doesn't quite recover. But it is actually an extraordinarily unified piece. It's unified, first of all, because it's homotonal, because it's all in D major and D minor. And so you hear the influence of that minor key opening in the later movements, in the second movement and in the finale particularly. And then it's also unified motivically. And the motive that we need to pay attention to, the most important one, there are a couple of them, but I'm only talking about one, is just a giant leap. The very opening melody of this Adagio is ya on the first violins. You may not quite notice the first sustained long note because there's stuff happening underneath it. It's actually a double theme and counterpoint that we hear. But the real tune is on top. All the stuff you hear in the first bar or two is essentially accompaniment happening underneath. So listen carefully for that long first note, and you'll hear immediately in the first violin the jump to a high note. That is going to be an idea that characterizes virtually all of the melodic material, at least in the first three movements. The finale is a slightly different case that we'll get to in a moment. But it's really remarkable how that idea, just a big jump in terms of pitch, can be the glue that holds the whole symphony together, a unifying concept, and it is. So for this first example, I'm going to play you, it's about 4 minutes, most of the opening movement. I'm going to play you the whole movement without the development and without repeats. And I feel kind of it's not fair to leave out anything in a Haydn movement like this, especially his development sections, which are marvelous. And this one gets us back to the opening in quite a beautiful and moving way. But what I want you to hear how the second theme, which is in the major key, is repeated in the minor key in the recapitulation, because it's such a marvelous, simple effect to achieve a true intensity of emotion. And it became, as I said in the previous discussion, Mozart's preferred methods. When beginning a piece of music in the minor key, he will invariably recapitulate everything in that minor key. Haydn stopped doing it. Haydn later liked to become happy at the end. It didn't mean there was less depth. It meant that the minor key meant something else in his later music. And what it means and how he uses it is a fascinating topic that we will get to when we get there. So let's listen to Helmut Müller-Brühl on Naxos with the Cologne Chamber Orchestra doing the first movement, the slow movement of Symphony number 34. It's gorgeous, gorgeous music. The exposition, then there's a little pause, and then the recapitulation, so you can hear the difference between the two. wonderfully moving music, isn't it? It's fantastic. Now, because the first movement was an Adagio, the second movement is a fast movement. And it begins with the same idea that the Adagio started with. Not the same tune, the same idea. This bouncing back and forth between high and low pitches. And it's so clear at the opening of this movement because it's ba, 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 ba. And then it just speeds it up twice as fast. Bum, 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 ba, bum, ba, bum, bum. I mean, it gives you the whole concept right away. There's also some wonderful writing for the oboes in the second subject. And the important thing, as I've pointed out, is this conflict between major and minor, which Haydn is going to pursue through the entire symphony, with the idea that the symphony is trying to shake off the heaviness of the first movement with varying degrees of success. And in this particular case, you'll find that in the development section, it's almost entirely in a minor key. And it's one of the wonderful things about this particular movement is how wonderfully Haydn manages the transition back to the recapitulation. Often in these symphonies, that's a somewhat formulaic moment. That is, the development is a self-contained section, and it comes to a full stop, and then the opening of the symphony crashes in again. But here, the development, which is rather dark, leads directly into that recapitulation. It does it in a very, very effective way with a crescendo. It's exciting. It's an exciting moment, and it's an embryonic example of something that romantic composers and 20th century composers were going to do all the time. They write development sections that rise to big, big climaxes, and those big climaxes inevitably spill over into the recapitulation, maintaining the excitement all along. One composer who almost never fails to do that is Shostakovich. And we're talking, 200 years later. But that's what he did. I mean, that's how potent a concept that was. And Haydn was the first person to do it. Probably the symphony in which he's most excitingly pursuing that concept is number 102. But there are others before it. Here is a wonderful example of a development section that really is wedded to the recapitulation and makes a lot of sense. The effort of getting back to the home key is part of the expressive point of the music. And I'll point it out to you when with a little superscript when we get to it. So let's listen to the entire second movement, which will be about 2.5 minutes long without repeats. And you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about without any problem. Now, the Minuet is a little bit different. It's all in D major. It has, or the major key. The trio section is different, but it's basically all in D major. And it doesn't partake of any of the more brooding emotions of the rest of the symphony. It's trying to be cheerful, but the cheerfulness is undermined in some ways. First of all, the Minuet theme itself is based extremely graphically on these jumps in pitch. It's clearly related to the themes that we've heard before. And, again, but you don't hear them in the same spot. There's sort of a bouncy thing at the opening, but it's the second half of the Minuet where it's going bum, 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 boom, you'll hear it. You'll notice it. The middle section, the trio, which I'm not going to play you, it's a jolly tune on the oboes, a really jolly tune on the oboes, but it's undermined by this constantly syncopated rhythm on the horns. Or underneath, so the oboes are doing da 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 bum ba da, but the horns are going chong 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 chong, which sort of upsets the apple cart a bit. It's marvelous. Haydn manages to be allegedly cheerful, ostensibly cheerful, but he's always doing subtle little things to let you question exactly what the expressive purpose is and where the music's going. So here is the Minuet, just the with no repeats, just the A section of the Minuet. And just listen for what we're talking about here, those jumps between high and low pitches. Even though the melodies aren't the same, like I said, they incorporate this idea into their syntax, into their language and way of speaking. And it's a language which is personal to Symphony number 34. So here's a bit of the Minuet. So now we come to the finale. And the finale is in a form which is really kind of extraordinary in its simplicity, and in its simplicity which is somehow rather disturbing, perhaps because of its very simplicity. The finale is essentially the same form as the Minuet. It's an ABA, with the same scheme of repetitions as the Minuet. That is, each section has two parts, each part is repeated, then there's a middle section that's repeated. But here's the difference. Whereas the Minuet refused to get into the minor key at all, the finale has an entire middle section, which is in the minor, and it's hushed. It's a very troubled minor. It's obviously, and it's based on the same theme as the opening of the finale. So it's all based on like one theme. And the question is, how is the symphony going to end? How is this symphony finally going to present this last opportunity we have at a tune? Is it going to be happy or is it going to be sad? There is that melodic jumping that we've talked about, but it's not in the tune. It's in the bass line. And you may notice it or you may not. I don't think it's really important. I think by this time, what Haydn is really focusing on is that struggle between major and minor. And this finale brings it out with such graphic simplicity. And there's nothing that you can miss about this music whatsoever. Of course, when the A section returns, it is in the major key. And so the symphony does end happily. But it's a condensed version, first of all, because all of Haydn's recapitulations either lose a repeat or two, or they're foreshortened. And this one's no exception. And so the question is, how happy is the ending really? How convinced are you that the final assertion of D major is absolutely, positively where Haydn was expressively wanting to take us? Or is there still room for some doubt? I find this symphony to be very, very interesting just for that reason. You know, Haydn is supposed to be, you know, Papa Haydn, ha ha ha, Papa Haydn, jolly old man, right? But I think a lot of his music is very ambiguous in what its message is. And I think that's one of the reasons it's not as popular as, for example, Mozart or Beethoven. You know, Beethoven wants to be heroic. He'll like jam it in your face. And Mozart is songful and beautiful. And when he's happy, he's happy. When he's sad, he's sad. Haydn is not so simple. In some respects, his personality was the most complex of the three, the most variegated. And his exploration of what music could do was in many ways the most daring. And he would be content to write a symphony that doesn't have an equivocal ending. And the tension in this finale between the extraordinary formal simplicity and the somewhat troubling emotional balance of the whole thing is just like no other music. And it's only 2.5 minutes long. And it's you know, it's for some reason I find it almost you know, enigmatic. I think that's the word. But you may disagree. See what you think. I think there's just a lot here in this music if you let it just wash over you without any preconceptions. So here's the finale. Now, that was the whole finale, repeats and all. And I think you could hear that it's somehow, somehow a summing up on the one hand because of the balance between major and minor keys, but on the other hand, a new synthesis of what that balance might mean. And almost open-ended, I think, in its implications. Fascinating symphony. One of Haydn's, again, sort of experimental symphonies in some respects. Not like number 32, which was all festivities and C major celebration. But I really hope you enjoyed this. This is a symphony to savor. You have to play it a few times and really get it under your skin. And because it's not allegedly one of these Sturm and Drang symphonies, it doesn't get much play. I mean, none of these early symphonies get much play, but this one, it's another one of these marvelous, unique pieces It's like nothing else anybody else was writing, and it gets no attention, which makes me crazy. It gets even less attention than these videos are getting. I wish everybody would watch them. There is so much great music that the people who are not watching them are missing. So tell everybody to watch the Haydn Symphony Crusade, please, because I just want them to share in the joy. It's incredible. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.